My name is Lucas. I work as a product designer at a startup, and this happened to me in Boston, in one of those winters that leave the sidewalks in Allston as hard as glass and the air with a metallic bite. I lived in an old wooden triple-decker, a rushed renovation where everything creaked at night and the steam heat hissed like a kettle. My apartment was on the second floor, facing Brighton Avenue, with the kitchen window looking onto a narrow alley where the garbage trucks rattled by at 5 in the morning. That week I'd been leaving work late because of a launch, and I got home around 11:30, face stinging from the wind blowing off the Charles. The first thing that froze me on the threshold was the door resting ajar, the latch barely touching the strike plate, like someone had hurried out and forgot to pull it shut. The envelope of bills I'd tossed on the floor earlier was 20 centimeters farther inside, as if a draft had nudged it, though there was no draft in that tight hallway. I wasn't sure I'd locked up in my rush that morning, so I did what everyone does to deny fear. I thought I probably forgot and slipped my hand in to push the door. When I went to close it, I felt resistance from the outside, a hand pulling back, a quick pressure that made me hold my breath like I'd plunged into cold water. I let go reflexively, and the door opened a little more, groaning, showing just the hallway washed in tired fluorescent light and the runner carpet leading to the stairs. "Hello? Anyone?" I said, lower than I meant to, because it felt wrong to speak loudly in that swollen silence of an old building. No answer, only a distant car taking Lombard Street and the tick-tick of the boiler climbing the pipes. I set my foot past the threshold, gripped the knob and yanked fast, and this time nothing held it. I shut the door and slid the chain, more psychological than useful, and felt my mind lag behind my body. The kitchen smelled like garlic from last night's pasta, but beneath it was a faint sourness, like a wet coat. The chair I keep tucked under the table wasn't as I'd left it. I always keep it aligned, and now it was slightly askew, a leg catching a different slice of shadow on the tile. I crouched and touched the floor, cold and dry, but the cheap Killam rug in the living room had a scuff near the armchair, as if a shoe had dragged. I moved down the narrow hallway, hand on the wall, to feel for movement inside it, and reached the bedroom. The wardrobe door was cracked, and I always push it until I hear the click. My heart punched into my throat for a second, and I pictured someone silent behind a coat, breathing shallow. I said my own name under my breath, like calling myself back to reason, and flung it open, ready to step back. Only my jackets were there, the scent of dry wool and a flannel I hadn't worn in months. I went to the living room window and looked down at the alley. The half-dead orange lamp threw a cone of light onto the asphalt, and a shallow mist slid along the ground, like dry ice. For a second, I thought I saw someone slip behind the blue recycling bin, but it could have been the shadow of a swaying branch near the meter boxes. I went back to the kitchen and saw the spare key I usually kept on a fridge magnet. Yes, I know it's dumb. Wasn't there. My breath stuck and my body went hollow. I knew I'd left it there under a magnet for a pizza place on Harvard Avenue. I tried not to spin out. I took a photo of the spot, checked the counter, the utensil jar, the spice shelf. Nothing. The idea that someone had entered, handled my things, and then taken the key hit like an intimate insult. I called 911 with a cold, sweating hand, explained, and in about 15 minutes 2 officers arrived, a short woman with her hair tied back and clear eyes, and a tall man with a square jaw. They asked measured questions, moved through the place with their flashlights low like they were hunting a cat, and inspected the lock. "No signs of forced entry," she said. Exact words like something cut from a report. "Looks like the door was just left ajar, sir," she added, jotting on her pad. I tried to show them the scuff on the rug, the turned chair, the palpable sense of occupancy, and the tall officer said to check with the building about a master key. The superintendent, Mrs. Lawrence, who lived on the first floor and scolded me for any noise after 10, swore the master keys were in a locked cabinet in the basement and only her husband handled them, and he died in August of a heart attack that had shaken the building like heavy gossip. That should have been the end. A scare, the police, nothing found, and I'd swap the lock the next day. But the next morning, when I grabbed my backpack, the pens inside were lined up like a tiny army by color and size, and I never do that. The zipper was fully shut, and I always leave a sliver open so it won't snag. That evening, when I got back, the bathroom towel was hung on the opposite side from where I always put it, with a perfectly crisp fold, and the hem turned inward like someone was following a private rule book. Once is forgetfulness, twice is distraction, 3 times someone is telling you a secret you don't want to hear. I stopped by a hardware store in Brookline and bought a simple lock set, changed it myself, and added a new chain and one of those door alarms that shriek if it opens. In the small hours, I woke to a dull thump in the hallway, like a foot testing the board. I lay still, listening to the heater ping, a car go by, 2 voices laughing far away. And then came a very, very soft brush at my door, a single second long, like a fingertip tracing a tiny arc in the wood. I sat up in bed, pulse in my jaw, and waited for the little alarm to scream. It didn't. I waited more. My phone on the nightstand read 3:12 a.m. I got up carefully, stepping where the floor creaked least, and peered through the peephole. The hall light spilled under the door like a blade, and there were no feet shadowing it. When I cracked the door, the chain held, and no one was there. I ran my hand over the wood, felt nothing but cold varnish, but I swear I smelled cheap perfume, that sweet aerosol kind that isn't mine. I started noticing some objects shifting by a few inches every day, always toward places that felt more correct than the lazy spots I'd chosen. The salt shaker slid 2 fingers to the right, aligning with the edge of a cracked tile. The stack of books on my nightstand was, one morning, in alphabetical order by the author's last names. The living room curtain was drawn 1 finger farther, so the fabric fell straight without that belly I'd never noticed. It was like an obsessive, calm person was tending the apartment with an ungrateful butler's invisible hand. I searched for secondary entries. The ceiling of my bathroom sat under the 3rd floor, where a guy I barely saw, Ryan, lived, always wearing a cap even in winter, smoking in the alley with his shoulders hunched. In the hallway, a square panel painted the same dirty white as the wall had paint flaking at the edges. An old inspection hatch, maybe for a duct, and the screw looked recently handled, the head slightly clean, dustless. I hauled out an aluminum ladder, climbed and tried to turn it, but it was stuck. All I got was a sore shoulder. I came down and heard an upstairs door close with that soft sound of rubber gasket and latch. I eyed the hairline crack running along the kitchen ceiling, the one that always reminded me I lived in a building that moves. When I lay down, sleep took a long time, and the silence between the radiator fuss and a bus turning the corner felt crammed with things. I thought about the missing spare key, the first tug at the door, and the image that kept coming was the same. Someone outside, in a hurry, trying to slip away unseen, as if my arrival had interrupted an intimate, clandestine ritual. I talked to Mrs. Lawrence again, and she said no one had asked for key copies, the basement cabinet still locked, that she herself fell asleep on the couch during the 10 o'clock news and hadn't heard anything. Her New England cadence made everything sound older. She squinted and said, "You work too much, Lucas. The building sings at night." I smiled and said yes, the building sings, but the music now had rhythm and rests. I went home with a pack of cheap motion sensors that buzz my phone when something trips. I stuck one on the door, one in the hall, and a third inside the bedroom closet. That night, I set them to send loud vibrations. At 2:48, the phone rattled on my chest like a borrowed heart beating wrong. I opened my eyes bone dry, staring at the screen. Bedroom closet. Opened. My body couldn't match the speed of fear. It took a few seconds to get up, and when I did, I banged my knee on the bed frame and swore too loudly. I held my phone up toward the bedroom entrance, its bluish light pooling. The closet was closed, the same thin gap as always, the same lifeless gleam on the knob. I walked to it, cold from the floor, traveling through thin socks, and touched the door. It was cool, and the metal had a trace of moisture like breath. I opened it and the smell hit. My scent mingled with another, a different soap, a little citrus, a hint of menthol, and behind it, a damp note like cloth drying in a badly ventilated place. No one there. On the floor, my left shoe sat a finger's width ahead of the right. I went back to bed, sat, breathed. The phone buzzed again. Hall, motion detected. All I heard was the radiator and very far off, a radio bleeding an old song someone had left on next door. I waited. The vibrations stopped. It was me and the idea that something conscious shared the space and took care not to be seen, as if it followed a dark etiquette. In the morning, I found the knives in the block with all blades facing the same direction, and the dish towel folded with a perfect crease, each corner aligned. I started setting margins. I wedged a penny in the closet door, just enough for it to fall if anyone opened it. I laid a hair across my dresser drawer like a silly trap I'd learned from a paranoia forum. I taped the main door jamb with clear tape, so flush it was invisible, drawing a tiny line with a pen that would miss a line if the tape broke. The next day, the line still matched. The penny still sat where I'd left it, but my hair had vanished, replaced by another, longer and lighter, resting at a neat opposite angle like a reply. I kept thinking about Ryan upstairs and the light steps I sometimes heard on the fire escape. One afternoon, I knocked on his door, knuckles tapping. He opened a crack, cap backwards, thin face with a week's beard. I asked if he'd noticed anything strange, anyone in the building, and he smiled without his eyes. He said he sometimes saw a man standing in the alley, just outside the cast of the lamp, smoking, and that the guy wasn't from any apartment. Said he'd seen the man touch the mailboxes as if measuring them with his hand. I asked for more, and he shrugged, adjusted his cap, said it could just be a delivery guy, and I shouldn't get involved. Before he shut the door, he held the knob tight, making that rubbery kiss sound, and said, "These old houses have paths we forgot exist." After that, he stopped answering when I knocked. I went to the basement, which smelled like cold earth and mildew, low ceiling cut by old and new pipes. The key cabinet was there, a metal box closed with a tired padlock, more decoration than barrier. Beside it, a wood panel sealed a square opening in the brick, painted white, paint bubbled by damp. I felt a thread of air coming through a seam, like a slow breath from the other side. I pressed my ear and heard nothing but my own blood. Back upstairs, I stared at the hallway hatch and decided to try again. I bought a hex key set and lubricant spray on Commonwealth Avenue. I climbed the ladder, sprayed, and turned millimeter by millimeter, the metal complaining with a trapped moan. When the panel finally yielded, a settled smell of dust and old wood fell on me like a blanket that had been folded too long. Inside was a hollow, an old, disused laundry chute, a shaft running from basement to the third floor, timber dark and saw-scarred. At the bottom, darkness. Looking up, a distant twin rectangle with a thin line of light on the third floor. Fresh marks in the powder, like knees and palms. A thin rope hung and disappeared, cut somewhere in the middle. The air had a different temperature, cooler, with a light damp that touched the skin like a breath. I backed away and sat on the hallway floor with the panel between my knees, considering the literal idea of someone moving through the house, like a shadow that knows the seams. I went to the kitchen, realigned the chair, and thought about calling the police with this new information. Instead, I took photos to Mrs. Lawrence. Her face tightened. She said that had been sealed since before she was born, that her husband had boarded it up years ago during renovations. When I told her about the hair, she pressed her lips and said I should take it to the property manager who lived in Newton and rarely spoke with tenants. That night, it felt like the apartment had heard what I'd found and decided to answer. At 3:11, the hall sensor buzzed again. I was awake, eyes on the ceiling, counting creaks like raindrops. The alert came with a tiny click inside the wall to the right of the kitchen, a click like two coins kissing, then tight little steps, weightless, moving through the wall alongside the hallway like big rats wearing shoes. The kitchen light, which I'd left off, flicked on and off, a short blink, as if someone were testing the switch with a fingertip. I sprang up, legs steady and foolish at the same time, and went to the kitchen with my phone as a flashlight. The switch was exactly where I'd left it, down. The dish towel over the oven handle had been folded into a triangle, and the trash can lid rotated to sit at a perfect 90 degrees to the counter. I said out loud, without thinking, "I know you're here," and my own voice came back as a flat echo. There was a thick quiet, and inside it, a faint scrape from under the sink cabinet, followed by the pipe's tick-tick, like someone tugging a hidden hose. I crouched, opened the cabinet carefully, and the back panel had a crudely cut rectangle, like someone had sawed it out and put it back. The edges had old dust, but the center looked touched. I got my fingers under a corner and pulled. The board moved like a dry tongue, opening onto a square hole, and the smell that came out was cold dust and stored cloth. I killed my light for a second and could just make out a tiny glint, like a fiber reflecting. I lit it again. Inside, against the framing, was a cheap earring with a fake blue stone, and beside it, a pen cap. I shoved the panel back on impulse, heart hammering, and only then realized that while I'd been kneeling with my head in the cabinet, someone had placed my wallet, left on the living room table, neatly aligned with the edge of the sink, parallel to the grout line. I hadn't heard footsteps. The apartment's air felt occupied, a quiet presence moving where I couldn't. I checked behind the couch and found a knee impression faintly pressed into the rug, the weave brushed in one direction. I called the police again. They came, examined the chute, took notes, and once more, no signs of forced entry. They suggested I stay with a friend, and I laughed with nerves, because what scared me wasn't violence so much as the inverted intimacy of this cohabitation. The next day, I bought a beefy hasp for the cabinet panel and another sturdy lock for the hallway hatch. I installed them fast with sweaty hands, thinking if someone truly used those paths, they'd have to find another seam. That night, the sensors went quiet, as if the building held its breath. 2 days later, I came home to the clearest, strangest message. Every photo in my frames, 2 with my parents, 1 with friends at the beach, had been flipped face down under the glass, still perfectly centered. Not vandalism, an arrangement, a crooked respect, as if I needed to be absent even in my representations. I picked one up and found an oval print from a very thin finger at the inside corner, like someone had disassembled the frame, flipped the photo, cleaned it, and put it back. I tried a different approach. I left notes. I wrote calmly, "Why are you here?" and placed it on the table with a pen beside it. I left for work with my stomach clenched. The next day I wrote, "Do you live in this building?" and left it out. That night I found the sheet folded neatly in thirds, like a letter, blank inside. I opened it and caught a new scent, something that brought to mind hallways and cheap perfume mixed with laundry soap. That same week I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside, a clipped piece of newspaper about a winter shelter closing. Old story. In the margin, someone had underlined in firm pen the sentence about many residents being temporarily relocated. I stood in the building S entry with the smell of fresh snow funneling in and pictured a person with nowhere to go, sliding into homes like a polite cat, tidying things, living in the margins of attention, and leaving when the owner returned. That night, I had come home too early. I started sleeping with the radio murmuring low on AM, barely tuned, because it felt like I was filling the apartment with something of mine. On some nights I woke with the sensation that someone had touched my forehead, a gentle check for fever like you do for a child. I know how absurd that sounds, but it felt like I was being cared for by a presence that repelled and organized me in the same breath. Once, I found a plate washed, and in the rack, when I was sure I'd left it dirty in the sink. A friend lent me a motion camera, and I tucked it behind books, covering the living room and part of the kitchen. I spent the day out, hungry to review. That night, there was almost nothing on the footage. A flicker of shadow at the edge, too fast to form, and for a single frame, the curtain puffed, though the window was shut like a body had passed behind it. The file froze and corrupted right after. I sat on the floor with my laptop in my lap, heart heavy, replaying that image like a bad beacon. At week's end, I rang the bell of the first-floor apartment, a student couple who always spilled laughter into the hallway. The girl, a blonde with a low voice, told me she sometimes heard my door open and close, with a gentleness that didn't match my usual rush, but she hadn't thought much of it because she also heard the steps of someone who didn't live there. Light steps without the routine cadence of a tenant. The guy in a Bruins tee said that one night around 2, he saw the silhouette of a very thin woman on the fire escape, looking at my kitchen window, and when he blinked, she was gone. I asked if they'd recognized the face. They shook their heads. The girl said the figure had a messy bun and a jacket that seemed too big, something covering the wrists. I asked if they'd called the police. The guy said no. Around here, you learn not to call for every little thing, that in winter, everyone slips into everything because of the cold, and maybe I should move. I laughed without humor. The next day, I bought a keypad deadbolt, spent more than I should and installed it. I wasn't just guarding my things. I was trying to preserve my sanity. The new code bought me a day of peace. On the second day, I came home, and the lock was engaged, the panel showing someone had tried multiple codes. 4 failed attempts, spaced through the afternoon. The hallway smelled like the student soup, and in the air, a dust note. I went in, and my desk was tidy in a way that was almost moving. Cables coiled, mouse parallel to the keyboard, napkin folded in smaller squares. On the window, a yellow sticky note stuck on the inside glass. In thin, straight letters, it said only, "Sorry." That word cracked the anger, letting a thread of pity through, and that disoriented me most. I didn't want humanity in this. I wanted a clear enemy, something to reject. Instead, I got the image of someone apologizing while aligning a mug. I stood in the middle of the room too long, heavy coat on my shoulders, and dusk fell before I turned on a light. Outside, the city kept going, the green line bell, wind lifting scrap paper on the sidewalk. At some point I cried, angry at myself for yielding to the smallness of a post-it. That night I slept with one eye on my phone, and at 3:03 it buzzed. Kitchen, motion detected. I got up slowly, padded over, stood at the corner, and waited. The cabinet under the sink was closed with the new latch, the window locked, the curtain trembling only from the heater's breath. There was, however, a sound very low, almost inaudible, someone breathing through a very narrow nose, a too quiet breath, coming from the shaft. I pressed my ear to the wall, and the sound turned into a denser absence, like whoever was on the other side was holding their breath too. I raised my phone toward the hallway hatch, and for a second, I swear I saw through the hairline seam a shadow cut by like an eyelash. I stepped back and said, with the voice I managed, "I'm calling the police." Silence answered. Then, as if the building synced to an outside cue, the radiator hissed, the pipe knocked twice, and overhead came a light thud, like a box set carefully down. My phone buzzed again, but strangely, without a sensor alert, just a bank notification, a $12 purchase attempt at a drugstore on Harvard Avenue. My wallet was with me, all cards in place. I opened it to check and saw that yes, The debit card I rarely used was there. But two old cards I was sure I'd cut months ago were inside, intact. I didn't understand. I called the bank, blocked the card, heard the rep's script telling me to stay vigilant. I hung up and went back to the living room, and there, on the floor by the door, sat a small drugstore bag placed with absurd delicacy like an offering. Inside, a cheap bar of soap, lemon with menthol, and a pack of bandages. It punched the air from my lungs by an invisible hand. It was as if this person had used my details to buy something that said something about them, set it before me, and waited for me to understand some odd code. What kind of coexistence was this? I sat on the floor, the jolt tiring me like a run. I looked around and noticed the dish towel had a pinprick cut. Someone had taken a tiny piece as a keepsake. I realized I was present in this person's life, the way they were in mine, and it made me nauseous. The cold tightened, shelters filled. It was on the news. I saw people sleeping at Packard S. Corner Station, wrapped in blankets that looked like crumpled maps of a person's story. I started carrying an extra coat in my backpack, not knowing for whom. At home, the intruder kept adjusting my routine a millimeter at a time. One morning, my alarm clock was 7 minutes fast. Another day, a glass of water sat at my bedside with the lip on the side I don't use. On a Sunday, I got another unmarked letter, with an old late-night movie ticket taped inside and one word handwritten: before. On the third Saturday of January, I decided to leave the apartment. I slept at a friend's place in Cambridge, left the cameras rolling, sensors on, and went with the guilt of abandoning a pet. In the morning, my phone lit up with everything at once. Door, open. Hall, motion. Closet, open. My chest cinched and I rushed back, head buzzing, every red light an insult. I arrived to find the door closed and locked, the panel unmarked. Inside, the apartment was impossibly clean. The floor looked new, the windows memoryless, the bed made with a perfect hospital corner. On the pillow lay a very light strand of hair, almost white, curled like an exclamation point, and a note. Thank you. I stood in the doorway too long. A few seconds later, someone upstairs took 3 quick steps and stopped. I heard the fire escape window close softly, like a goodbye without a person. I went to the kitchen and opened the cabinet. The panel was shut from the inside, the lock in place, and still, from inside the shaft came a different cold than the hallway. A cold that smelled faintly like outdoors. Once again, the police wrote there were no signs of forced entry. The report probably matched the others, the calendar only changing dates like a paper shedding repeats. I changed the lock a 3rd time, a model needing a card and code. I slept with the hall light on, annoying or not. Even so, the small changes continued, less frequent now, subtler, as if the presence were migrating. A drawer I remembered as sticky slid smooth the next day, lubricated. A shirt that had vanished reappeared, washed, hanging in the back of the closet, smelling of that cheap soap I'd come to recognize. On a windy night, I heard a different sound. Not footsteps inside the wall, not the steam hiss, but a kind of very contained crying. The sound someone makes trying to be a ghost. It came from the basement, wicking up through pipes. I threw a coat over pajamas, took my flashlight and went down. The basement was a maze of arranged shadows. Bikes leaned, old beach chairs, and in the back that white panel swollen by damp. The padlock I remembered on the key cabinet hung there, but open, tongue jutting. I set my ear to the panel and, I swear, heard the building breathe. I went back to the 2nd floor and shut my door carefully. I sat on the living room floor, head against the wall. The house answered with a pop, and for a moment I felt an illogical peace, like I'd accepted a parallel life pressed to mine. The real fear was something else, realizing that even if I moved, I would carry the question with me, like a protein glued in blood. Who was with me? What did she want, beyond order and a sliver of soap? I slept on that floor, and when I woke, someone had draped a throw over my feet. In the days that followed, the presence seemed to thin out, like an animal learning to search new territory. In the alley near the bin, I found the blue fake stone from the earring, and beside it the pen cap, aligned like two words finally in the right order. I took them upstairs and left them on the fridge under the pizza magnet. At work, I answered emails with mechanical politeness, and at night I climbed the stairs, listening to the woods' private music. Sometimes I caught myself tidying the place with someone else's care, aligning mugs, stretching sheets, as if I were becoming the presence that had terrified me. One night I got a text from an unknown number. "You changed the locks again." I stared at my phone like it was a living thing. I replied, "Who is this?" No answer. Minutes later, another text. "It's better this way." I didn't sleep. At 4, I got up and made coffee, the sound of water boiling anchoring me. Kitchen light drew rectangles on the floor, and in the geometry I noticed a new scratch on the door paint, small, like a tiny map. I ran a finger over it and felt the rough edge, the evidence of a nervous nail. It's hard to explain how things end when they never start clearly. I could say that one night I heard footsteps going down the fire escape and never noticed anything again. I could say the sensors stopped, the letters ceased. I could say spring came and I watched people eat in the park sun and I never thought about it anymore. That would be a lie. What happened was a fading. The shifts became coincidences, the smells dissolved into habit. Fear settled in a corner like a heavy piece of furniture you shove and forget. Even so, sometimes, on that edge between sleep and waking, I feel the faintest tension of the door being pulled from the outside, like that first night, just enough to remind me there's a choreography other than mine. I get up, pass through the kitchen, check the cabinet, press my ear to the hallway hatch, and hear nothing but the building breathing. I go back to bed and tuck the collar of my solitude under the covers, and before sleep I think about the word sorry written in a firm hand and wonder if there isn't tea. In fact, someone in the world who only wants to exist in a clean corner of a house that isn't tea theirs. A few months later, leaving the building, I crossed paths with a thin woman in the hall, early 40s maybe, hair wound into a hasty bun, jacket too big, the faint scent of lemon and menthol. She looked at me neutrally, asked for nothing, and passed with the consideration of someone who doesn't want to get in the way. I almost called to her, almost said a name I didn't have, and then I let the door ease shut behind me with that small press of latch against strike. On the sidewalk, a breeze brought the smell of laundry drying somewhere wrong, and I headed for the tea with the sensation I'd forgotten something at home that, in truth, doesn't belong to me. That night I found the kitchen chair a little crooked again, at the angle only I and it would recognize. The old yellow sticky note lay in a drawer, and the cheap soap by the sink hadn't been touched by me in weeks. The building creaked, the Green Line bell chimed in the distance, and in a silence that wasn't empty, I said softly, "I notice." The air didn't answer. The radiator hissed. Something very light brushed the doorframe, the sound of a fingernail on wood with tenderness, and that was all. If you ask me now whether I'm sure someone truly shared that apartment with me, I'll say yes, and then say certainty isn't the important part. What matters is that sometimes human presence introduces itself as aligned objects, and brief apologies as flipped photos and a bag of bandages, as a cheap earring and the building's breath. The police didn't find signs of forced entry because there was no crime their categories apply to. There was a coexistence that doesn't fit on letterhead. I still live in the same place. The hallway hatch has a new lock, the sink cabinet another. I sleep better when the apartment is very tidy, as if I'm honoring an agreement. Sometimes I notice a little alteration only I would see. A pen at a truer angle, a towel with a fold I don't make. The clock nudged a minute fast. I go still for a moment, recognizing the gesture, and then I go on living. And on windy days when the door catches with that tiny pressure, my hand holds the knob gently because I can swear that outside someone still holds it too, trying to slip away unseen. And I let them go, because in some way I can't explain that apartment. And I learned to step apart slowly, each matching the other's pace, without ever fully closing the door. If this story kept you on edge, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more chilling experiences.